This is Merle and Helen Squires. We have been married 54 years. I was born in Ringland, Oklahoma. My parents were Dewey C. Squires and Faye Squires. My dad was a Baptist minister, so it was a small town in Ringland, Oklahoma, and I doubt if it's grown even since that time I was born there. But we lived in small towns such as Apache, Fort Cobb, and Geronimo. And later on, we moved to Lawton, Oklahoma, but that's we lived in Texas in between that. We'll get to some of that later. But I was born March the 3rd, 1930. And a lot of time people ask when I was born, I say it's 3/3/30, and it kind of takes them by surprise because of the numbers. But that's the way the numbers works out. And easy to figure out how old I am because it's an even year. What would you like to add to this?
I'm Helen Faye Hannah Squires, and was born to Milburn and Retha Squires, Milburn and Retha Hannah, on August 12th, 1933. My parents lived in Missouri as they grew up and lived right across the road from each other on their family farms. And my dad came from a family of 15 children, and my mother had, there were 7 children in her family. My parents came to California then when my sister was just real young. She was still a baby. I have one sister, Ella Mae, who is 5 years older than I am. And my parents came to California, and Dad was seeking work out here. And this was in the Depression years, and so it was very difficult to make a living during that time. So that's kind of the start of and the background of where I came from, and we'll go on from there.
Yes, I paused just a little bit while ago when I was introducing my mother. Her maiden name was Kelly. I just went blank all at once there, but her maiden name was Kelly. And I believe my grandmother on the Squire side was Badgett.
My mother, her maiden name was Tennis. Her mother, was, I think she was half Indian, and I don't know exactly what the background of my grandfather was on my mother's side. I only met them once when I was 7 years old. And my grandmother at that time, Mom's mother, was close to death, and the family had called her and asked her to come back and see her mom before she passed away. But my dad now came from a family of 15 children. His mother was Mary Alice Hannah, and I don't really know. Oh, I think her maiden name was White. But Daddy's father died when he was 6 years old, and my grandmother Hannah was not able to go to her husband's funeral, my grandpa's funeral, because she had her last child the day he was born. I thought that was kind of an interesting situation for her. But they lived on, my grandmother Hannah had a very nice farm there in Nixa, Missouri. And like I said, Mom and Dad lived right across the road from each other on their family farms.
Well, it's kind of interesting. Back in those days, they had larger families. I think my dad's family had 11 or 13 kids in their family. And coincidental, his dad was a Baptist preacher. And actually, there was 3 boys then. Dad, Uncle Alvin, and Bill was preachers also out of the Squires family there. And on down the line, Uncle Alvin's son has become was a preacher, and he's located at he's pastor at First Son of the Baptist Church on the beach in California here. And actually, our son Greg is a pastor also, is a preacher. So there's a little background. Now,
You also have a brother who's a preacher.
also I had, yes, my younger brother, I was going to get to that a little later, is a preacher, and he lives in San Jose, California. Some of my younger years there, as I recall, I was pretty young. I don't know what age I was, probably past 6 years old, when we moved to Decatur, Texas. They call that the county seat of Wise. Dad went to college there at Decatur Baptist College, which since has moved over to Dallas. I'm not sure what they call it, Baptist College, I believe now, but it was Decatur at the time and located in Decatur, and it was set up on a hill on the edge of the town there. And we lived pretty close to the campus there, and we were fortunate enough to kind of be out to ourselves a little bit there, and we had a pasture there, and we had some cows. And I remember one of them we called JC, because that's what was her brand was on her. We just called her JC all the time. Anyway, we had 2 or 3 or so cows, and we milked them, and we were there a few years. Dad attended college there, and also was a field evangelist to go out among the people for the college. And then from there, he went over to the seminary, Southwest Baptist Seminary at Fort Worth, Texas. We lived on Townsend Avenue there, and while there, he was pastor at halftime churches. One week he would go to one group of churches, another he'd go to another church. And one of the churches was close by, which is Addison, Texas, which is right near there at Fort Worth. But the others was way down in Oklahoma. So every other week it was quite a trip. But he always took his families with him, and we had places we stayed away from home on weekends. So we grew up that way there, and later on, after that seminary work, Dad was called to Calvary Baptist Church in Lawton, Oklahoma. And he had a real good ministry there because it was during the war, and Fort Sill is located nearby. And so he was able to reach out, and I think established 5 mission churches there while he's pastor there. And I'm sure several of them are still churches there. Cameron Church is probably larger than the home church now. And Emmanuel Church is still existing. I'm not sure about the other churches there because I hadn't been out back there in quite a while. But that is some of the background there. Would you like to add something to this?
My parents grew up together and went to school together there in the Ozarks of Missouri, and they, after they married, they came to California. My dad came out first and tried to locate a job and a place to live, and then my mother and older sister came out a few months later. My dad originally, when he came out, got a job at the Santa Fe Railroad in San Bernardino and worked there until he injured his eye on the job and had to leave that particular vocation. And for the most of his life, he was a truck driver. And I remember him doing that more than anything else he did. There was a short time for a few years that he owned a service station, and but other than that, he mostly trucked. During the Depression years, it was so difficult to have anything at all, and they were very poor. And I can remember my dad telling stories about working for just pennies a day almost, and not enough money even to put food on the table, and he would have to stand in some of the soup lines, they called them, during the Depression, and he felt very embarrassed about that, that he couldn't provide enough for his family and had to do those things. But that's the way life was then, and I was born right at the tail end of the Depression, so I don't remember any of that, but I've heard a lot of stories about it.
Well, back to Lawton there, I attended junior high and high school, and also Cameron Junior College. Graduated from high school and the junior college at Lawton, Oklahoma. And during that period of time, I was a paper boy for about 8 years, and I had probably the largest route in town, probably 350 customers. But it gave me money to spend while I was in high school and college. Well, from there, from Lawton there, we Dad felt glad to even though I was up 20, 21 years old, I was still living at home. And Dad felt led to come to California. So we moved to California, and several places that he that was wanting him was Orange, which is a lovely town, and Laverne. And he felt the Lord led him to Laverne Church, and he established First Baptist Church, which met in a lodge hall at the time. They didn't have church buildings, so he was instrumental in building church buildings and established a church in Laverne, which was actually controlled by the Brethren, and they had Church of the Brethren and another Brethren church here, and that's all they wanted in that city. So they had quite a fight to establish and broke through. I guess they have all denominations in the city now, but at that time they didn't, and they didn't want any more. But the university is located. It was Laverne College where I attended there, but it became a university, and it's quite a university now. It's places people in teaching facilities. People would like them because they have credentials from Laverne, so they're established in that area, and they got satellite campuses and even a law school down in Ontario, California now. So they're a university now.
And you graduated from that college.
Yeah, I graduated from Laverne. Well, a little background about my brothers. I have one brother, Zerl Squires, who passed away approximately 2 years ago. He was 19 months older than me, and I was a baby of the family for 19 years. And then my brother, he's Dewey Elf. They named him Dewey Elf, and my father's Dewey C. So sometimes a little confusing when people talk about my parents and my brother. But he's 19 years younger than me, and so we were able to kind of treat him as growing up a little bit and he, as I say, became a preacher then when he was this young fellow there, and he had a mission work down in Temecula, California, which at that time they called Rancho, and they actually voted on to call it Temecula. And then he went to the seminary in Kansas City, and then came back a short time and spent as a mission pastor down there again, and then he later became a pastor at Downey, California, and then Pasadena. Now he's in San Jose, and it's kind of coincidental. His son is also a minister, and he went to California Baptist College and was pastor down at Lake Elsinore, and now he's down doing a pretty good work at 29 Palms, and that's where Marine Base is located there, and they're in the process, well, just completed a large auditorium, and the war situation now, the Iraq War, has kind of been hard on the families there because some of them had to go overseas. Would you like to add a little on? your background?
I grew up in Ontario, California. My parents seemed to settle in Ontario, and my sister and I both went to 3 schools in Ontario: South Euclid Elementary, and then Vina Danks Junior High School, and then Chaffey High School, and graduated from Chaffey High School. I always wanted to go on to college and major in music, but I didn't seem to accomplish that. But I'm grateful for the background that I've had, and the fact that even though in my young years my parents were not Christians and they were not attending church, I had one of my dad's cousins used to take Ella May and I to Sunday school every Sunday morning to Temple Baptist Church, and I was in a Sunday school class there that I had a wonderful teacher who just loved children, and her name was Mrs. Pfeiffer. And I can remember learning Bible verses and earning little gifts for having memorized verses, and the things that went on in Sunday school were very impressive upon me. And then when I was probably about 6 or 7, men at my dad's job had been witnessing to him. He was kind of worldly in those days, and some of these gentlemen who were members of the First Baptist Church in Upland worked with him and started witnessing to him, and got him to come to church. And he and Mother both were saved in the First Baptist Church in Upland. And our lives, I can remember, just took a total turnaround. There was no more alcohol in the home, and our life just became so peaceful, and where there was turbulence before, that was gone. And I had a great growing up, and a wholesome home to live in, and parents who loved each other and loved us girls. And so we had a good background from that point on in our lives, a spiritual background. And my sister became a Christian when she was in junior high school, and then I was saved at about the age of 9, and always felt so privileged that the Lord made this change in our family and in our home. I can't remember a time in my life that I did not have a real desire for learning to play the piano. And I remember when I was just real small, my parents had this little heater, that freestanding heater in the living room, and it had some grates across the top that if you ran your fingernails across it, it would make sort of a zing sound. And when the heater was not on, I would stand in front of that little heater and play that like it was a piano, and then I'd run my fingernails across it and make it make this musical sound. And my folks thought that was pretty funny. And I kept on wanting to play the piano, wanting to learn to play the piano, and we had a musician in our church that I just idolized, and Ruby Wilson was her name. And she played for our church, and she also played for a male quartet that my dad sang in later. And so I watched her every service, and the more I watched her, the more I knew that this is really what I wanted to do, is to learn to play the piano. And then later in my life, I came to the point, after I had had some lessons, that God wanted me to use that talent for Him. And I promised Him that if He would allow me to learn and that I would use that talent in service for him. And so that's basically what I did the rest of my life. I started taking music lessons at the age of 11, and by the age of 14, I was the pianist of a good-sized church in Ontario, Temple Baptist Church. And I was their pianist until I was about 17, I guess. And I felt honored that the church would ask me to do that. But God blessed me in my music, and I was so diligent and so eager to learn that He really blessed me and allowed me to learn, and I was privileged to be able to use that talent in service for Him for the rest of my life, and I still am doing that. Daddy, after having injured his eye, he went to work at the Orange Products in Ontario, which now is known as Sunkist, and he worked in the warehouse. Later, during his career there, he injured his back moving around the big barrels of orange juice and things, and so that was the time in his life. He suffered a great deal with his back, and so that was the time in his life that he went into trucking and did that for the rest of his life. He retired as a trucker. But my mother worked in retail. She worked at what was known as Newberry's, which was a 5 and 10 cent store downtown in Ontario, and then later worked in a retail bakery in Upland. And she did that until such time as they retired.
Well, I think I stopped at Laverne, and that's actually where part of our lives came together, mine and Helen's, because there we had met Helen, and I was still in college when we met, and we started seeing each other, and she'll tell you probably how that we met, but we became engaged, and we were probably planning on kind of long engagement, but I think we were going to get married in August, but we ended up getting married in May 1951, May the 10th. And why we did that is my draft board was after me, and you can't change draft board. My draft board was in Oklahoma, and they were calling people up in the drafts, and I was called, but I got deferred to finish college. So we decided to go ahead and get married. So that's why we got married before the August time, and Helen was still 17, but she would have been 18 if we had waited. But we felt like it was best to go ahead, and we hadn't regretted it at all.
Well, there was a lot that I learned after I met Merle as to how it came about that we met each other. I was playing for, accompanying a male quartet that my dad sang in, and we would go to Sunday afternoon singing conventions almost every Sunday afternoon. We'd go to Sunday school and church, and then we would head for the singing convention wherever it was, and the quartet would sing. And Merle would attend these singing conventions, and I did not know him at the time. But he saw me on stage accompanying the quartet, and he and a couple of his buddies would attend these singing conventions. And I later learned that he told his buddy after he had seen me there that I was the girl he was going to marry. And it ended up that way, but not for a while, because I didn't know who he was. And then the pianist of his dad's church was going to take a vacation, and the minister of music asked me would I come and fill in for him and play for the services while he was gone. And I agreed to do that. And So Short Reeves was the minister of music, and he would come and pick me up in Ontario on Sunday mornings and then bring me back after the morning service and come back and pick me up for the evening service and bring me home. And the third Sunday that we did this, he called me on that Sunday morning, and he said, I'm not going to be picking you up today, and but Merle will. And I didn't know who Merle was at that point, even though I had noticed this young man who was always carrying a baby on his hip coming around to me at the church services, after the church services, and talking to me, and I thought he was married, so I didn't pay much attention to him, and I didn't give him any encouragement. And I just thought he was a nice-looking young man, and every Sunday he would come and try to talk to me. So at that point, I really had not made any connection with who Merle was, and that morning, when Merle arrived at our home, he came, knocked on the door, and I opened the door, and there stood Merle with this baby on his hip again. Joey Francis was probably about a year old at the time. And I just always figured that this was his child, and he was married, and I didn't want anything to do with him. So on the way to church that morning, I found out that Merle really wasn't married, and then that was his little brother, who was 19 years younger than he was, and that he was the pastor's son. And so having gotten that straightened out, I felt a little more relaxed and a little more receptive to knowing who this good-looking young man was. So from that time, from that Sunday, Merle began calling me, and we would talk 2 or 3 times a week, and then he would ask me, could he come and pick me up and bring me to church, and we started going to church together and started dating, and that was the beginning of our courtship. But it was rather unusual that I thought at the time that a young man would be carrying his little brother around with him all the time, everywhere he went, but he was really bonded to Merle and loved Merle and still does to this day, and he called Merle Bud. And so that's kind of the way Merle and I began our courtship.
Well, I was deferred, and when I finished college year, I decided, well, I'll just wait as long as I can to go in the service, because I was deferred to go to college. So I found a few jobs in constructions, and during the years I went to college here, I worked in the summertime. At one time, I worked at the Orange Exchange here in Laverne. Another time, and I worked at a Windfrost. We had big wind machines that would circulate air around, and we used to what they called smudge.
The groves.
The groves, orange groves. That used to be the heart of the Orange Empire. Laverne, they had oranges all over the place, and they had 3 packing houses there in Laverne. But one year I worked for what they call Frostmaster, and they built those big machines there. And when I got out of college there, waiting for going to service, I did some carpentry work. And I think one year during the break, I also worked at as a grunt for carpenters. There was 2 of us. They were building tract homes, and we would haul all the lumber to the carpenters, me and a Mexican fellow named Jeff. And I always thought that was funny, because this was summertime, and he always wore one of these big heavy coats, looked like a army type coat. and said it shaded him, and it could be up at 100 degrees, and yet he'd wear his coat. Well, I also worked at Kaiser Steel Mill and construction. That's when they were building the steel mill. The Kaiser Steel was already out there, but they were building a tin mill. And I worked out there for about 3 months or so. But anyway, the draft got close to me, and I knew it was close. So I started looking around to get in the Navy rather than the Army. And it was hard to get a recruit office that was needing people. And I think over towards Compton, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere that way, I was able to find that they would have some that was available for the amount that they could put in the Navy. So I enlisted in the Navy, and I went to what we used to call boot camp down in San Diego, California. And the first, I'm not sure, about 8 weeks or so, they actually was at Camp Elliott, where we took training, which was also in San Diego, and then we went back to the main base. But while there, we didn't get liberties for quite a while there, but when we started getting liberty on weekend there, I'd park my little car outside the base there, and I would head for Ontario, where Helen was. So that was a commute back and forth there for a while. Mm-hmm. And then from there, when I completed the boot camp training there, they sent me to South Texas. But they would not allow us to drive on our own or commute down there on our own. They put us all under orders and sent us on a train. Well, I had met a nice fellow called Dick Pettit, and he had married while in service, and his wife, it was named Helen also. So they worked it out between the two of them that they would come down to South Texas, and so Helen Pettit didn't. Helen Pettit didn't drive, but she navigated for Helen while she drove. And we had a little 47 Chevy at that time, their Club Coupe, and it was packed clear up to the ceiling with the things that we had. And so we spent about 2 years in South Texas, what we call Kingsville, Texas, which was auxiliary base, is Naval Air Base, auxiliary base from Corpus Christi, which is 40 or 50 miles away. So it was a nice atmosphere there. It was kind of like working. We'd go out and do our job at the base, and then we could come home, put on civilian clothes, and go to church and be with the family and so forth. And we met a lot of good people.
Can we, excuse me, honey, but let's back up just a little bit here and relate that, of course, by this time we were married. We married on, as Merle said, we married in May of 1951, and had a nice wedding. Merle's father, being pastor of the church there, did our ceremony for us and officiated that way. And my sister was my matron of honor, and we had a nice little church wedding, not a formal ceremony, but I wore a two-piece white suit, linen suit, and Merle wore a beautiful double-breasted navy black color suit, and we had a nice wedding. Avery Dacus, who was the pianist at the church, played for our wedding, and then Mickey Peel, who was one of the gentlemen who sang in the quartet that I played for, sang at our wedding. And my sister opened her home to our reception, and everybody traveled to Ontario after the wedding ceremony in Laverne for the reception, and then we left from there and went on a honeymoon to Sky Forest, and we spent about 4 days up there. The last day we were there, it snowed the night prior, and we woke up to snow almost to our knees and in some areas up to our hips. So we decided it was time to pack up and go home. And Merle needed to get back to school, and so did I. So we were married in May, and then Merle went in the service in February of '52, I think it was. And as he said, he had to go down to South Texas on the train with the troops, and Helen Pettit and I had talked on the phone and met each other that way, and
She lived in
Gardena, wasn't it?
Gardena, which is about an hour away at that time from where we lived, or where Helen was.
So we made arrangements for us to go down. Mom and Dad went down with me, and we loaded what few things they had and came back up to my house and packed them in this little 47 Chevy and took what few belongings we had and took off for Texas. And this was the first time I had ever been away from home. So it was pretty traumatic for my parents as well as for me. But I drove the whole way. As Merle said, Helen Pettit did not drive. So she navigated and watched the maps and helped me to know what roads to take and how to get there. And we spent 2 days, I think it was, and 2 nights on the road driving to Kingsville, Texas. And
coincidental, Kingsville, Texas was 1,800 miles from around Laverne in Ontario to Kingsville, Texas, but half of that actually was in Texas. When you got to El Paso, Texas, when we were halfway home, when we come home on leave, we'd leave, do half the traveling in the state of Texas. So when we got to El Paso, it was halfway home. But we did have a good honeymoon. Skyforce is in the San Bernardino Mountains, between Crestline and Big Bear, between Lake Arrowhead and Big Bear, about midways. And we had a nice little cabin there. I'd made arrangements there, but we were surprised when we got up there. The people had furnished our refrigerator even with things that we could have there if we wanted to eat there.
Bacon and eggs and
bacon, eggs,
butter and bread and milk and all kinds of things were in the refrigerator when we arrived. We were surprised at that.
But we almost got snowed in up there. It was still snowing when we left, and we didn't have change. We didn't expect it to snow, so we had to leave a little earlier than what we wanted to, but we needed to get back anyway, but we had to get back. But from South Texas, Kingsville, Texas, I got my orders for sea duty. And
before you go there, tell what happened to you while we were in Kingsville, though. Merle was in what was known as the crash crew, and so tell about some of that. And
yeah, I was in the air branch of the Navy. I was an airman, and we would have 3 engines with the crews stationed at each field. We had north and south field, and these 3 crews would be on duty at all times, and they would stay underneath the control tower. There's a building underneath the office building where we would stay. But we have one crew out on what we call a hard stand, which is out kind of middle of the runway, on standby at all times, and we'd rotate back and forth about every hour to send a new crew out. But when we had a mayday or an emergency come up, as we'd call it, we would all go out. So I was, I think we were doing a weekend flying on a Saturday, and I was inside when they got a mayday, and there was already a fire engine out on the hard stand, But we always put our gear on as we were going out to the runways. We have to put them on as we travel. Our big bunker coats on, our boots and all that kind of stuff. And when we approached the hard stand, that guy didn't stay there. He pulled out, so our driver whipped in. And I had to be on the other side there. When he whipped, I whipped off to the asphalt and broke my arm and mandibles and did quite a bit of damage. But I was able to recover. I think I stayed in a hospital at Corpus Christi for several months. I had my Helen said my mandibles, which is the bones that I care, broken, and they wired my mouth together. They put little braces on your mouth, on your teeth, and the way I say wired together, they actually put these little tight bands that go each of those little things, rubber bands, and I had to wear along with my dog tag. Well, of course, in the service you always had to wear your dog tag, but on that dog tag, I had a little small pair of scissors, and they said if you ever got sick, clip those bands because you'll probably die if you get sick and nowhere for that to go. So I think it was several months there I wore braces there, but it was after I got that out, I was still in the hospital with my broken arm, and to pull Liberty, I learned to operate one of these big buffers to do the floor buffing there. I was able to do that one hand, even though I had the arm in the cast, so I could get Liberty to go see Helen. Of course, she was able to visit me in the hospital occasionally. But we had such nice families in Kingsville that we had some that adopted Ma and Paula Chisholm. They kind of adopted all the service people in our church. But they didn't want Helen to stay by herself while I was in the hospital, and so she lived with them, or stayed with them while I was still in the hospital. You want to add anything to that before we go to sea duty?
Well, that was kind of one of the major things that happened to us in Kingsville. We joined the Calvary Baptist Church while we were there, and it was a church that had a lot of the Navy couples in it. And back then you had training union on Sunday evenings, and we became active in the training union, and the training union that we were in was made up of these Navy couples who were away from home, you know. And Merle mentioned Mom and Pop Chisholm. They were the sponsors of that training union group, and so we made lots of lasting friends, people that we still keep in touch with. During that period of time, we were in South Texas for 2.5 years, and Mom and Pop Chisholm were just like our parents away from home. They were wonderful, and they had 2 daughters, and we became, the 2 girls and I became really close friends, almost like sisters, and it was probably one of the most growing parts of my life. I had a lot of growing up to do because I was only 17 when we married, and we, at this point, had only been married a year or 2, and I had a lot of growing up to do, and never having been away from home before, I spent some homesick times in South Texas, but all of these friends that God put in our lives, and Mom and Pop Chisholm just made our life so pleasurable, and we both grew spiritually, and we grew closer together in Texas. It was a good experience for us. We didn't have any money except what you earned in the Navy, and so we were rather poor, but I can remember that at the first of the month, Merle liked RC Cola back in those days, and at the first of the month we would go to the RC Cola bottling company and buy a case of RC, and then you could get it for a nickel a bottle. And we'd bring that home. And before the end of the month was up and there was no money left over, we would end up cashing those bottles in just to maybe buy milk for the baby who was there by then. Brenda was born in Kingsville. And well, she was actually born in Corpus Christi, where Merle had been in the hospital too. And that was the nearest hospital to Kingsville. That was a Navy hospital. So Brenda was born there while we were in Kingsville. And we would always have to manage every penny. We had one incident I can remember. One day Merle and I went downtown, and I said that I needed a new half slip. And so he handed me a $20 bill, and we both went into this store, and I was looking through this table that had slips on it, and picked one out and got up to the cash register to pay for it, and I didn't have that $20 bill. I couldn't find it anywhere. I went back to the table where the slips were, and there had been some other people around that table, so I assumed that what happened probably was that I dropped that $20 bill looking through those slips, and somebody saw it and took it. And to lose that $20 bill was really devastating to us, and I was so embarrassed and so hurt that I had lost $20, because that was the difference in having food on the table and not having food on the table. So that was kind of a funny little incident in our lives that we managed to live
Well, our
through.
parents was good. It seemed like occasionally they would send money down just when we needed it, without us asking for it.
Yeah, that's true. Both of the parents did that. We would just receive a letter, and it would be X amount of dollars, and it was money that really made a difference to us, and yet we never asked our parents for anything in those days, but they were always very sensitive to our needs and realized that we were living on a shoestring, and they were always willing to help us out.
Yeah, that real significant, because Brenda was born in Kingsville, or well, it was at Kingsville, that Corpus Christi where she's born, but Helen also, while I was in service, I think I was home on leave, and she was having problems with kidneys at the time. But from the time we married until actually almost Brenda was born,
After Brenda was born,
they were she was still having problems. They couldn't find out what was wrong with her, and we were home on leave and visiting our parents. Her folks still live in Ontario. Mine still lived, I believe, in Laverne. And she had one of those bad attacks there, and there used to be a large naval base, or hospital, not a base, but a hospital out at Corona, California. Beautiful, nice facilities there. So we went out there, and they determined that she was going to have surgery for her kidney, and they removed one of her kidneys while we was in service. So that was a significant thing at that time also.
Yeah, right. Brenda was 5 months old, actually, when that surgery took place. But it was right about that time that Merle had gone aboard ship, too, because he had gotten his orders for sea duty when Brenda was 2 weeks old. And when Brenda was a month old, then we came to California. Merle drove us out to California, and she and I, Brenda and I, moved in with my parents, and I kept house and took care of Brenda, and my mother worked, and of course my dad was working, and so I ran the house and cooked the meals and took care of Brenda and did all the domestic things while Mom worked, and Merle was aboard ship in New York at that point.
Well, actually, sea duty consists of me. They sent me to Brooklyn, which is in New York, Brooklyn shipyard there, and they were going to recommission an aircraft carrier called the USS Ticonderoga. And it had been the mothballs that on the Pacific coast side, which is Washington, and it was too large to go through the Panama Canal, so they had to tow that thing clear around the Cape and in the Brooklyn shipyard. So to recommission ship there, you just have to kind of rebuild the insides and everything on them. And it was in the shipyard, and the naval personnel actually stayed across the street in the barracks, and we'd go across each day and do ship work until the ship got far enough along where that we could actually move aboard the ship and do the work there. So we were back and forth there between the barracks and the ship for a while. But about the time we got that ship ready to go, they were going to send over Bayonne, New Jersey, which is right across from New York. And from there, I guess it was around Christmas time, and I came home on leave, I think, at Christmas. And first time I ever rode an airplane that you had to face backwards. Back in those days, they were experimenting on these airline. I forget which airline it was, but actually the seat was faced backwards, which I didn't enjoy too much. I'd rather face frontwards. So that was a little experience there. But when I got back off of the leave at Christmas leave, we worked back and forth at Bayonne, New Jersey for a while. And from there, we went down what they call a shakedown cruise. And our home base was established as Norfolk, Virginia. But we stopped at Jacksonville, Florida, and went on down to the Mediterranean there. And we were in and out of Guantanamo Bay quite a bit, but we was out at sea quite a bit, and went in Liberty to Haiti and some of those kind of places while we was down there. But we was there during the winter, and it was really pleasant weather there. But after we got back in our home port was going to be Norfolk, we had a schedule that looked like we were going to be in there every weekend. And so we thought, well, we'll have Helen and Brenda to come also and live with us. So we sent for them, but that was a year of bad hurricane seasons. And we spent quite a bit of time, because the aircraft carriers, they would not tie them up. They'd beat them to death, I guess, so they sent them back out to sea every time they had a hurricane that year. And so we spent a lot of time out at sea when we didn't plan on it. But we did enjoy Helen and Brenda being there at Norfolk until I got shipped over to the Mediterranean. And they stayed at Virginia. So I think I just had about 8 months left. Yeah. And so they stayed there while I went overseas. And I could have extended my tour of duty and stayed with the ship if I would extend my tour, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to come back, so they put me on a different ship and sent me back home. And I was discharged at Norfolk, Virginia. And you have anything to add about Virginia there?
Not a lot. Virginia was a really different environment than anything that we either one had been accustomed to, and we looked and looked and looked for a church for a long time before we ever settled in one, and I can't remember whether we ever joined that church or not.
Yeah, Rural Baptist.
But anyway, having been a church musician almost all of my life, there was one situation that I thought was very peculiar. They had this huge concert grand that sat down on the main floor, and the church choir and the organ were up in a raised choir loft up above where the podium was for the speaker and everything.
Kind of like a balcony.
And that's where the choir loft was. And the organist played the organ and directed the choir with her head. And the piano, this beautiful big piano on the main floor, was never used. And that was so frustrating to me because I wanted so much to get a hold of that piano and play for the services, and yet no one ever played the piano. And it just sat there on the main floor. And so that was kind of a frustrating experience for me. It was a very different worship environment there for us than what we had experienced before and what we had had in Texas. And
it's more formal type of worship
yeah.
than what we had been used to. And of course, Helen had always played piano in the churches that we'd been in South Texas. She was even church pianist, so I guess it would be kind of bad to see piano not being used when you have the talent to use it.
Well, why don't we get back home after discharge? We made a trip. We bought a Buick, was it? We bought in
Chrysler.
a Chrysler. We bought
Oh, wait a minute now. We bought our
it
first
was.
car was a 47 Chevy.
Well, the one
Club
that we bought
Coupe.
in Virginia, though.
And then then about before we went to Virginia, we bought a 48 Pontiac, one of those kind of torpedo type, beautiful two-tone car, but it was in California, and we was in Virginia, and we had wore the wheels off of that little stroller for
for Brenda.
pushing Brenda around. So we bought a Chrysler, big black Chrysler Windsor, and it was a nice car. It got us around. But back to Norfolk a little bit there. Well, before Helen came, Dick Pettit and I, we were able from boot camp to stay together all through our naval career. So we would go on Liberty together, and he wasn't a Christian at that time, but he'd always attended church with me in chapel services whenever we went, and wherever Sunday. But we would go on Liberty together, and we'd take pictures and just walk around mostly and sightsee, go to museums and do things there. And we got to go to Philadelphia one time there. I might mention while we was on that, before we went to the Shakedown crew, Ed Sullivan was pretty big at that time and had a TV program, the Ed Sullivan Show. And we had our aircraft carrier had seen catapults on it. So we tied up at Philadelphia there, and they had the program there. I think it's the first ship that they shot planes off standing still there, and because Justine Capital shoots them off anyway. But down in Virginia there, I think I lost my train of thought without getting back to Philadelphia.
We're talking about you and Dick.
Yeah, me and Dick would take Liberty before Helen came there. We were walking downtown Norfolk on one weekend. And it was a long downtown street, and then we walked over another block, and I think it was called Church Street, as I recall. And I think I only recall that because of the incident that happened to me. It evidently was the black, and just a block over, the black section of downtown. And the SP, which is Shore Patrolman, caught us there and says, you get on that bus and get out of here. And we said, well, we walked in, we'll walk back. Well, they didn't go for that, so they put us in their paddy wagon and hauled us out to the boondocks way out from town there and just dumped us. But I always thought that peculiar because we had so much discrimination, going back then that we wouldn't able as white people to walk down where the black downtown was. And we didn't intend anything by it. But while I was overseas there, we stopped at the Rock of Gibraltar, which is Spain, and had Liberty there, and Naples, Italy, and Cannes, France, and some of those places there was able to get Liberty there. But during our maneuvers out at sea, we would have these flight things going on where the air branch of the service, they would be on duty, and the people on the ship there, they just have their regular duty. And we'd hear pipe down commit ship work, or we hear stop ship work, and we'd still be working. But during the night flying and the day flying there, one time my the incident happened there aboard ship that was bad for us. Commander Johnson was my commanding officer, and I was kind of his yeoman at the time there.
On the aircraft carrier, we had general quarters and flight quarters, and during the period of time when we were in flight quarters there, we had a plane come in. I think it was an Air Force exchange pilot on board our ship. We have, on our ship there, we had catapult, and we recovered in the same direction as the planes are taking off. The later models of aircraft had a cannon deck, which they recovered or land the aircraft at an angle, so if the airplanes didn't catch on their barrier and cables, they had two things they would catch on. They had barrier. First, the Navy pilots would come in with their tail down and hit a cable and snag that cable, and that's supposed to stop them. But then they have these barriers that go, the nylons that are so wide, and they would go up, and that's supposed to stop them. But this pilot that we had from the Air Force evidently got shook up or something other, but he didn't throttle down. And so he went through those two safety features, and we were taken off as we recovered, which we do in flight quarters. And he hit those planes and stuff up front and actually killed 7 of our people in that, and he went over the flight deck. But I think the ship, it appeared to me, went over him, the aircraft carrier, but we were able to recover him, and he was alive. But that's one of the things that happened when, the worst thing that I think happened to us while we was out at sea is losing 7 people, and my commanding officer, and also a good Christian friend that we made there. It was hard losing those people because you get kind of close to them. You know, a ship, the ship itself probably has 200 of the regular people on there, and then they get the flight crews on when they go to the sea. They get these squadrons from the shore bases, and so you really got a large amount of people on there. And you tight quarters, you get to meet a lot of people and get to be friends with them. But anyway, that was my experience over there. And then I would not, as I said earlier, I'd extend my time, and we chose to come. I think Dick Pettit also, he enlisted the same time I did, and we were together all during the time, and he came back also on the ship we came back on.
Which was what?
Well, we came back on a battleship, and
Yeah.
and we just did ship's work, so on our way back across the ocean there, and flunky type of things that they do on ships there.
That was when they got back to Norfolk, Virginia after that particular cruise. It had been several months since we had seen each other, and Brenda, of course, had grown a lot in that period of time, and it was such a happy reunion time for us. And here were all these Navy wives standing out there, what do you call that? On the
Well,
where the ships
tarmac,
come
I
in.
guess you might say.
We were all standing out there, had driven out and waited for the ship to come in, and a lot of happy families were reunited that day, and it was such a joyous time. And I know Merle was glad to get home, and it was so good to see him again, and Brenda was thrilled to have her daddy back.
Aircraft carrier, larger ships usually anchor out from, and they don't get to tie down at the pier like smaller ships do. And so we have little Liberty boats or whatever that bring us all on to the shore there. So you have to wait in line. You have to kind of stand in inspection. They won't let people off those ships unless you got shiny shoes and properly dressed. so you make good impression on civilians there. But
And you did.
and so that was part of our time there, and we had 2 apartments there while we was in Norfolk. We had a 2-story apartment that we stayed at first, and we was able to move in to another one that had a nice family underneath it while I was gone. It worked out real good for Helen because that was a caring family.
Well, they were the owners of the home, and they had made an apartment out of the upstairs part of the house. And they were probably in their 60s, mid to late 60s, and they were so sweet to Brenda and I, and just treated us like we were their own kids. And so if I had to go to the market or something like that, and she saw me coming down the stairs, she'd say, well, why don't you leave Brenda with me? And so sometimes I would do that just so she could spend some time with Brenda, but they were very, very good to us.
Well, we met a fella, we didn't know him in Kingsville, but we met a fella there that was transferred at the same time we was. His name is Jerry Fosdick. And Helen might want to tell you about that experience because he didn't get to go with us on a trip. He had some kind of physical element at the time we went out to sea and went overseas. And so he stayed at Norfolk, and we made friends with him there, and Helen did too. And she'll tell you about the experience she had there because it was real nice that the thing they did
Well,
done for
his
her.
wife and little girl, who was at the time about 3, came down from New York. They were New Yorkers, and they came down from New York to be with Jerry. And so Christmas time was approaching, and I couldn't afford to go home for Christmas, and they were going to drive home for Christmas. And they invited Brenda and I to go home with them for Christmas. And Jerry, his family, his parents lived on a dairy farm, and that's how he had grown up. And Mimi's parents worked in some other kind of occupations. I can't remember exactly what they did, but they brought Brenda and I home with them for Christmas, and we were there for probably about 10 days. And they treated Brenda and I like we were part of the family. They hung socks for us like they did the rest of the family, and they prepared gifts for us, and they really treated us royally and allowed us to just be a part of both of the families' activities while we were there. And so we were so appreciative of that. And for many years, Merle and I, after we got out of the Navy, we would try to find a family in need that we could help because we had been so blessed with that particular situation in our lives, and it meant so much to Brenda and I.
And we're still in contact with them there. They eventually, he went business for himself, I think, as a mechanic in an automobile business back in New York State. And eventually, though, he sold that and moved to California. And so we were, originally they moved to Whittier. So we was able to stay in touch with them occasionally. And he also, after, I think, became a supervisor in one of these dealerships for auto repair, but eventually got into real estate. And then he moved to Las Vegas in the real estate business there, and bought a home and a condo back there. And then now they're back in California. They have been taking care of caregivers for
Mimi's mother.
her mother, yeah, Mimi's mother. And she just recently passed away, so we need to make contact with them again. But they're one of the Navy friends that we contact, and we made about, during the period of time that we've gone to several Navy reunions at about 4 to 8 families get together that we knew each other down in Kingsville even. And so we're still in contact and made real good friends. Now Jack Curtis is a fellow from Alabama. He's a real good friend down at Kingsville, and he had one of those Studebaker
some of you might not remember the car Studebaker, but it had a kind of torpedo like an airplane nose on it. All came to a point, and he had one of those, and he was a real good friend of ours. Went to church with us, and he would always make us laugh. He'd say, "When you say Alabama, you show all them teeth." And we'd get a big
He
kick
was
out
from
of him.
Alabama.
Yeah, he's from Alabama, and he'd have the Confederate flag on his antenna on his car. So we made a lot of good friends there. His wife, he was married at the time, but his wife didn't come down. She continued to work at home for some kind of a
And
department
she
store.
had the same maiden name as I had. So she thinks that someplace along the line that we may be related, but she had the same Hannah maiden name that I did. We need to move on to some of the other subjects that we need to talk about. And
Well, we came home then, cross country. We had a car
After
at
the
that time
discharge,
with that old
uh-huh.
Chrysler that we had. It was a nice car, and we drove it across, I guess, about 3,000 miles, and met friends that we knew, Little Rock, Arkansas, we knew in service, and came through Lawton and met relatives, and on through home, and we established home in
Pomona.
Pomona. Yes, that's right. We bought a duplex when I got out of service.
Well, actually, your dad bought that.
I bought it, and well, the dad bought it while we was in service, and then we bought it from him when we got out of service. But it's through him that we was able to get it, and so it was kind of a big help because one side of it was rented out, which is upstairs, and we lived in downstairs. So we lived there for a while, and enjoyed it there, and we moved back up to Laverne there to my dad's house. He moved to
New home.
he moved to a new home in Laverne and had that one there. So we moved there. It was a 2-story home. We lived there several years there. But
But during this time, during these years, Greg was born, and Keith was born, and Debbie was born. We had 4 children, and each of the children were 2 years apart, except for Deb and Keith, and they were 18 months apart. And during these years that we were having children, Merle worked 2 jobs. He had gotten on with General Telephone Company, GTE, and started out as a lineman and worked his way up, and they saw in him merit and asked him to go into the management training program, which he did, and I think he was in that for about 3 years, were you?
no, I think it was approximately 3 years. You can't be in each department. I went in several different departments. You couldn't
Training in each department.
be in, you
yeah.
couldn't be in them but a certain amount of time there, and then they would make arrangements for going to another department. So I learned a little bit by doing that.
So anyway, he worked his regular job in the daytime with General Telephone Company, and then in the evening he was a snack bar manager at one of the drive-in theaters in Pomona and Ontario, and he I think worked for $1 an hour or something like that there. And I, at the time that Greg was small, sold Avon, and I had my territory was up in Piedmont Mesa, in Claremont and Laverne, and one Saturday I was up there and I made a wrong turn on a street and came across a lot that was for sale, and it was all orange groves in this area, and the growers had done an experiment with the groves in a part of that section, and it seemed to not be successful, so they pulled the trees out and they subdivided that particular plot of ground, and there was one lot left there that had not been built on, and So I came home that day and told Merle, I said, I found a lot today that I would like you to see, and that's for sale. And we had been saving as much as we could of the money that he earned on his second job. And so we drove back up there, and I showed him this lot, and he thought it was really a nice area and was very impressed with it. And we took the telephone number down and went home and called these people and made an appointment with them to talk with them about buying the property, and ended up buying the property and paid for the lot with Merle working the second job. And we knew that we couldn't get a loan to build until we had the lot clear, so we got the lot paid off and were able to build our first home in 1960, and we moved into it just about in June of 1961. Debbie was about a year old at the time that we moved in there. We watched the construction of that house and critiqued everything. It was just such an exciting time in our life to be able to have a house contracted out and watch it go up and look forward to moving in it. It was a 4-bedroom home with two and a half baths and a family room and living room, and it was just a lovely home and very well built. And the children, when we moved in, they really thought they had a great life there, because we were crest in all these orange groves, and they had all this freedom for playing, and the area was quiet, and so they thought they had moved into paradise almost, I think. And so we had a great life in Laverne and lived in that home for over 30 years before we sold it. But we might back up a little bit here and talk about after we married and got out of the service, and we came back to California and got involved again in the church in Laverne, where Merle's dad was still pastor, and stayed there for several years, and then moved our membership to First Baptist Church in Upland, where I was the musician there as well. Merle was ordained as a deacon after we got home from service, wasn't it?
In Laverne.
In Laverne. And
Well, I might mention also there that Judy's, our daughter-in-law, was raised up in El Monte and went to the church at El Monte, and that's where our California Baptist College got its start, is at that church there. And they were wanting to move out of the church into their own facilities, and the people had located property over in Magnolia Avenue over in Riverside, but they didn't have the money to pay for the property. Daddy had a knack of raising money, so he took a leave of absence 2 different times from the church at a year each, I think, and to go raise money for the college. And that's how the college got its start, because of the money. And I might mention, he traveled as far as South Texas. He came down to Kingsville, and Jack Curtis heard him on a Wednesday night and preach, and he had a sermon that he preached. A lad is here to raise money for the college. And Jack Curtis heard that. And one of our reunion, after we got out of service in Austin, Texas, we went to a naval reunion, and he was just telling how much that meant to him, that sermon.
Oh, it impressed him.
And when he got out of service, he became involved with the Alabama Homes for Orphan Homes. And he said he went over across the country preaching that same outline that Dad had preached, because he could almost, and I got it on video too, because we sat there on that piano bench that day there, and he repeated almost that whole sermon to me, and I got it on video. But that's how much impression it made on him.
It changed his life. It really did. But as Merle said, his father was very instrumental in raising funds and raising money for occasions and for causes. After we went to the First Baptist Church in Upland, Brother Cresswell was pastor there, and that's where Greg became a Christian and was baptized. And later our membership moved to 11th Street Baptist Church, where it still is today. And our children virtually grew up in that church. And Greg we were attending Bible school one year, and Greg and Brother Mack, our pastor, Reverend McMahill, came to me. I was playing for the Bible school that year, and they came to me, and Brother Mack said, come into my study because Greg has something he wants to share with you. And so I went into the study with them, and Greg shared with me that he felt God was calling him to preach. And I was just so overwhelmed with this and so touched by it. And he was about 10 years old then, and so he preached his first sermon in his grandfather's church in Rubidoux when he was 12, and that started his preaching career and has been preaching ever since. But a lot of good things have come out of his ministry, and he had a good background with Brother Mack as his mentor, and we've been grateful all through the years that God sought him out and laid his hand on him and asked him to be one of his ministers and the gospel ministers. So he's dedicated his life as a young child too, and has been faithful to that all through the years. Keith is a couple of years younger than Greg, and he is very musical, as Greg is, for that matter. Greg taught himself to play the guitar, and he's been creative in writing some gospel music, and uses his guitar in his worship as a pastor now. Keith was interested in learning to play an instrument and get in the band at school, so he chose to play the saxophone, and has become a jazz artist and is now teaching music and band in Newport Mesa School District in 3 different schools there, and he's taught private lessons, and he's played some professional gigs, and he was in the Battle of the Bands and in the Hollywood Bowl, and he played in the Monterey Jazz Festival. He's quite a jazz artist, and we're very proud of Keith and proud of all of our children because all of them are professional people. And Brenda has worked with General Telephone Company, which now is Verizon, for almost 30 years, or maybe 30 years already.
25, I think.
And then Debbie wanted to become a nurse, and she went to Azusa Pacific College and got her nurse's training there, and has worked at City of Hope through the years. So we're very proud of our family and our kids, and we had a great life together in Laverne. We had a lot of fun, and we played a lot of family games together and bonded. We vacationed together. We bought trailers and did camping together, and had a lot of good bonding that took place in our family, and have remained a very close-knit group. We lived in our home in Laverne for a little over 30 years, and then when Merle retired in 1987, I stopped working that year too. I had worked for 20 years in the clerical field, and my last job was at General Dynamics in Pomona. Previously, I had worked at the Pomona School District and had another job in the front office at a hospital in between those two jobs. But I had worked for 20 years by the time Merle was ready for retirement, and so I quit working that same year. And after a couple of years, we thought we would like to sell the home and move where we could have a little less upkeep and a little less work to do, and maybe live a little more reasonably. So we moved to Hemet and lived there for 15 years. But the family never was happy with our move to Hemet and kept saying, you need to get back out in the valley here and be closer to us. So 3 years ago, we moved back here and live in Upland now, in a nice home in the midsection of Upland.
I might mention that while we was at Hemet, we did spend a little bit of time at Lake Elsinore. We moved over there, so kept our home in Hemet, but we actually moved over in my parents' home. My dad had an accident, and eventually
Car
a
accident.
car accident, and he caught pneumonia when he was in the hospital a couple times. And he was, I think, just near 90 years old at the time. And Mother needed caregiving. We told Mother that she's either going to have to come to Hemet or we're going to have to come over there to take care of her at Lake Elsinore. And she preferred for us to come over there. So we said, well, we'd like to have our own furniture if we come over. So she agreed to that. So we moved all our furniture over, and we lived over there until she passed away. And she was actually about the same age Dad was, I guess, about 89 when she passed away. But we was caregivers, and that's no easy job. But it was a blessing to us to be able to minister to her needs. And Helen, at the time, was still playing piano at Upland here, driving back and forth. I wasn't able to come. And so she was having to go by herself a lot of times on Sundays to church and keep in touch with cell telephone when she left the church in Upland, so I'd know where she was.
Might also mention that during that time frame in Elsinore, we not only took care of Merle's mom's needs and were caregivers for her, but we totally refurbished that mobile home that they lived in and spent a lot of hard work and long hours making that place over and making it very livable. We had air conditioning installed, and by the time we got through refurbishing it and everything, then that was when we moved our furniture and things in and continued living there then until she passed away. And we sold that property then and moved back into our home in Hemet. Then it wasn't too many years until we then moved out to Upland again. And we live about 10 minutes from Brenda and about the same amount of time from Debbie. Brenda, well, of course, Brenda met Bach when they were in high school, and Bach's parents had moved out here from Texas, and it seems that there was instant magnetism in their relationship, and they dated for a while and then married, and Brenda was still in college, and Bach was working at the time. And then a few years later, Greg had met Judy at California Baptist College, and Judy Pace, and they struck up a friendship and a romance, and they were married. And then Keith and Debbie were the two that were left at home, and Debbie, however, married before Keith did, even though she was the youngest. Keith was so involved in his music in college and all that he really wasn't interested that much in dating, and he stayed involved with his music and actually went to school basically so he could be playing and in the bands and things, and did a lot of traveling with the school bands, and got to go to Australia and to Hawaii and different places that the bands went. But Deb married then, and she has 2 children, Benjamin and Hannah, and Greg has the 2 boys, Alan and Robert. Alan is married and Robert's still single. Brenda and Bach had 2 children, Bradley and Bethany, and they both are married and have babies. Bethany married first and has a little boy, Jaden, about 2.5 years old, and we're enjoying the great-grandchildren now, as well as we did the grandchildren when they grew up. So we've had a good life, and God has been good to us. And
Yeah, so far we have 4 kids. We had a boy, then 2 girls, and
no, we had a girl.
a girl
First.
and 2 boys and a girl. So, and then we have 7 grandchildren, and then we have 2 great grandchildren. So God has blessed us.
And that's where our fortune is in our family. They have blessed us and made us proud and have rewarded us in so many ways through the lives that they've lived and the careers that they've chosen and the things that they've accomplished in their lives. So we praise God and thank Him for all the blessings that He's given us through the years and allowed us to try to be faithful to Him in our service to Him as well. Merle served in every church that we were in as a deacon. After he became a deacon in Laverne, all the other churches that we were in from that point on, he served as an active deacon. And so we've been active and busy in the church through the years, and the children grew up that way and have continued that in their own lives.
I'd say our family, we're really fortunate that they all are desire to go and get their education, because they all graduated with 4-year degrees, and some of them have got master degrees, and that's a lot on their own initiative, because I guess they just assumed that we would like for them to go when they went on to get their degrees and also some master degrees along with it.
Well, we encouraged that a lot too, because I always wanted a college education and did not get one. Merle had a college education, and I felt like it was so important that the children be able to have as much education as they possibly could. And so even though we were not financially able to provide all of that, they either would get jobs and work their way through school or whatever was necessary to get their educations. And so we're pleased that they all have their degrees and are working in professions that they are enjoying.
I don't know that we said where the kids all live. Craig and his family lives in Lancaster. Brenda lives in Upland. Debbie lives in Claremont. And Keith lives in Long Beach, which is all, within a short drive from where we live. The furthest one away would be about 1.5 to 2 hours away.
which is Greg and Judy.
45 minutes an hour to go down Long Beach.
I don't know much of anything else to say except I think I'd like to retract just a little bit and tell a little bit more about my parents' background. And like I had said earlier, they both grew up on the farm. They went to school together in a country school, and knew each other most of their lives. My father had to quit school after the 7th grade and work on the farm. With 15 children in the family, you can understand why that was necessary. And none of the kids, I think, had anything past a junior high education. Some of the younger ones may have had a high school education, I don't know, but it's doubtful. My mother had an 8th grade education. She was very gifted in math, and she was very gifted in sewing, and could have been a teacher or a CPA or a seamstress or a designer. There are a lot of things that she could have done with her life had she had the education for it. Both of them, however, had good heads on their shoulders and made something of themselves and provided a good home for my sister and I. And I'm so pleased that they rose above the fact that they did not get to have the education that they would like to have had, and still had a good life and provided. My father, in later years, ended up with cancer and passed away in 1979. No, in 1989. He was 79 years old when he passed away. And then Mother lived another 5 years before she passed away, and she had heart problems, and she died of congestive heart failure. But I was pretty much the caregiver for Dad as far as getting him back and forth to his doctor's appointments at City of Hope in Duarte, where Debbie worked, and she was instrumental in getting him in there for care. And I did the same thing for Mom after Daddy passed away. She lived back and forth between my sister and I. And Ella Mae pretty much took care of the financial end of things for her, and then I took care of her physical needs as far as the doctor's appointments and physical care for her. And she would come and live with me for 2 or 3 months, and then she'd go to Ella Mae's for 2 or 3 months. And that's how they finished out their lives. I think that's about all I can remember to talk about and emphasize in our growing up and our meeting and our marriage and our wonderful family, and how blessed we've been through the years. And we thank God every day for meeting our needs and taking care of the things that He promised that He would.
That's right.
You know, time has a way of moving quickly and catching you unaware of the passing years. It seems just yesterday that I was a young girl, just married and embarking on my new life with my husband. And yet, in a way, it seems like eons ago. And I wonder where all the years went. I know that I lived them all. And I have glimpses of how it was back then and of all my hopes and dreams. But here it is, the winter of my life, and it catches me quite by surprise. How did I get here so fast? Where did the years go, and where did my babies go? Where did my youth go? I remember well seeing older people through the years and thinking that those older people were years away from me and that winter was so far off that I could not fathom it or imagine fully what it would be like. But here it is. Husband retired and he's really getting gray. He moves slower and I see an older man now. He's in much better shape than me, but I do see the great change. Not the one I married, who was dark and young and strong and handsome, but like me, his age is beginning to show, and we are now those older folks that we used to see and never thought we'd be. Each day now, I find that just getting a shower is a real target for the day. And taking a nap is not a treat anymore, it's rather mandatory. Because if I don't lie down and rest on my own, I just fall asleep where I sit. And so now I enter into my new season of life unprepared for the aches and pains and the loss of strength and the ability to go and do the things that I once did. But at least I know that though the winter has come, and I'm not sure how long it will be, this I do know, that when it's over, I will enjoy the spring in the arms of my loving Father and wait for my loved ones to come when their winter is over too. So if you're not in your winter yet, let me remind you that it will be here faster than you think. So whatever you would like to accomplish in your life, please do it quickly. For remember that scripture in James 4:14, our life is but a vapor and it vanishes away. So do what you can today, because you can never be sure whether this is your winter or not. You have no promise that you will see all the seasons of your life, so live for God today and say all the things that you want to your loved ones to remember. Life is God's gift to you. The way you live your life is your gift to God. Make it a fantastic one and live it well.